Hi, this is your host Apil Bhartiya, and welcome to another episode of TFR Let's Talk. And today we have with us once again my favorite and Schlemmer, CEO of Percona. And once again, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me back. It's nice to see you.
What kind of scope you see of open source in the AI world? Because there are a lot of initiatives. Meta Llama 3, if I'm not wrong, is finally open source, which was not the case with Llama 2. Linux Foundation is doing a lot of work in this space, but I do want to understand from your perspective, how do you see open source and AI?
I think that there's continuing evolution, if you will, on the term open source and what does it mean, particularly with AI. Um, are we going to have some redefinitions? As an example, just continuing to stay up in the industry and reading about it, there's open source investigators. And what are they saying by open source investigators is the data. The data out there is, I would say, public data, but maybe using the term open source, which is very different than what we say for open source software, right? When we're talking open source, we're talking about the code, where in AI, are we now going to be hijacking that word, if you will, open source, to say anything that's public data that's being used? That's how they're training the models. So that's a concern that I have, and just understanding overall there's so much around the data privacy and that data that we're using. Are we using it correctly? Are we following GDPR? People are taking in this data. Are they using it for the intended purposes? Are they maintaining it? Are they right? Are they getting rid of it when they should be getting rid of it? So there's a lot of complexity, obviously, with this and overall. So understanding the models and going back to AI and that source availability or source code, what does that mean to help us use it in a way that will be productive and beneficial is important, but really understanding the terms that are being used and how they may be evolving and changing is going to continue to be a challenge, I believe.
There's so much debate going on about companies scraping data from website, books, articles, and even videos. Even if the data is on the internet, it's not public domain, it's still dictated by copyright laws. It creates privacy issues, it creates copyright issues, and a lot of other issues. How do you look at this problem?
Well, that's where I think that the landscape is evolving and changing, right? And making sure that we're taking the time to either reaffirm what the definitions are. In some cases, it's educating folks what those definitions are. If changes need to be made, then those have to be out in a public discourse and having that discussion, right? So we do see in AI that folks are coming and saying, hey, that is a copyright infringement, not necessarily on the software, but the fact that if an LLM just put out, if ChatGPT just attributed something to, say, New York Times, but they didn't credit from the New York Times, but that's where they took it. There are already laws in place. Now, the technology is evolving rapidly, right? We all can see that it's evolving rapidly. But are the thoughtful conversations taking place to make sure that guardrails, parameters, laws, all of that are keeping pace? Because a lot of those didn't see this coming necessarily and didn't have those protections intended for what the technology is doing now. So when we go back to open source and OSI, very clear on what those definitions are. Again, do we look at how has things evolved? How is the technology evolving? Are we keeping those protections and intentions in place so that we can continue to take advantage of these advancements in the technology that's happening? So I think it's hard to keep up, quite frankly, but making sure that people are willing to have those conversations, which you're seeing around, but again, keeping that pace because of the number of stakeholders involved when it comes to definitions and regulatory is a bit different than companies that are being innovative with their technology, right? They're just going for it. So it's a challenge. It's a big challenge that we're going to be grappling with for a while, I suspect.
We always talk about, that it's about copyright. Do you feel that some of these licenses, whether we look at OSI, FSF, or Creative Commons, uh, they were written in an era where the way we used to consume software was different than the way we consume it now? And even if you look at the software side of it, it was all about copyleft and copyright. Do you feel that we may have to come up with new licenses, new copyright licenses, new copyright laws for AI world?
That's an interesting question. I think it goes back to intent and the purpose, right? So even when you're saying that folks that are changing their licenses or the license change that we've seen that you and I have spoken about before as well, what is that intent? Is it that they feel that there's really unfair competition? Is it that there's more resources, right? It's always about providing value, and what is that intent? So if you're trying to build a wall and have a higher profitability and you feel that someone's being unfair, then it seems like you're changing the rules as you go along, or maybe in someone's favor over someone else. Maybe they're just more effective in what they're doing. So do we need to change? Potentially, but I want to be really clear as to why. Why do we think we need to change the open source licenses? Why, if they're the way they're written today, can they accommodate what is happening in the AI? Or is it just inconvenient for folks to say, hey, we're innovating really quick. This is really cool technology. We just want to go. Don't limit me, right? Is that the purpose? Or is it somebody might make a better mousetrap than I am, and I don't want them to have that ability? So I think it's just really trying to understand, always start with what are you trying to accomplish? What is the basis for OSI, and the licenses that are out there are really clear. So do we need to change those, or do we just need to continue to educate, make a bit of adjustments, and really still believe in why has open source been so popular? What is that value that we believe in? I believe in. I believe you believe in as well. What is that advantages of being able to take advantage of putting something out as open source, right? So I don't think it needs to be a whole redo. I think it's a matter of just really understanding what people's intentions are.
I mean, if you look at the evolution of licenses, GPL version 3 is a very good example where SFS created their license to avoid position. That's a totally different topic. That what kind of organizations embraced it, they did not embrace it. I mean, if you look at the music industry, artists complain that in the old days they used to make money from selling CDs and other venues. Same with the movies. After theaters, they go on videos, they go on CDs. But everything has changed with the streaming. Now they don't have any control over the revenue model in this new setup. Same can be said for AI, Gen AI, or software as such, because the way we create and consume or distribute software has also changed. So, do we really need new licenses?
For sure. And they weren't anticipated when it was originally written, right? We just didn't know that. Similar, like the example that you gave, how the music industry has evolved and making sure that people are getting paid for their work, and the users have some rights as well. So agree on that. How do you make sure that evolution takes place? And again, going back to what's the intent, that problem trying to solve, so that equity, if you will, the equity between the creators and the users. How do you make sure that it's win-win, right? That's, for me, that's always been the beauty of open source, that all boats rise. How do you manage, right? To have all boats rise might be idealistic, but how do we figure out that problem? How do we figure out that problem?
Are there any examples of companies who are doing the right thing in the AI space, that when you look at them, you're like, hey, this is how it should be done? Just the way Percona is a very good example in an open source space, where you have a very No compromise approach to open source, that open source means open source. So are there any companies in the AI space that we can point that, hey, they are doing the right thing?
You know, well, it's just like define right. You know, you made the example of what Meta is doing, right, with Llama 3. So I think that's obviously an evolution over time that the large enterprises are embracing open source in a way to give back. People will always argue, are they more consumers than givers, right? In that, but I think that those conversations are being had. I would say that it's maybe unfortunate to see how the evolution of OpenAI has gone. It seems to have gone the opposite way. And we started the conversation saying, how are people using open source or open? I feel like it's the what we see on the consumer side and people using the word organic, right? What's the you mentioned marketing. Is it marketing? So who is doing it right? I I think that I think that the larger companies are watching and paying attention to the smaller startups and what they're doing, and having their eye on it, and how obviously people are in there to how do they make it to the advantage to increase productivity, increase profitability, right? Understand that, but coming in and saying, hey, there is an advantage for us to putting it out as open source and continuing to grow that way. So yeah, I am hesitant to name to name companies because of, as I've said to you in previous conversations, I'm not in their boardrooms, I'm not in their executive sessions and what they're trying to do. But I'm always encouraged when I see companies even putting a portion of it out as open source because that this helps drive the innovation for everyone.
Are there any efforts that are going from the government side, or how much concern do you see is there from the public sector, from public, from groups, advocacy group, from open source communities, and do you see some of those concerns can be translated into actionable items that we can turn into regulations or laws? Where are we?
I think conversations are being had. One group that I follow is OpenUK, and they definitely have been very active in engaging with their political landscape in the UK, but also further out in Europe. I know that in the United States, our legislators at a national level have been looking at it, but I think that the quickness of technology and maybe the bureaucracy that we believe to be the government isn't happening quickly enough. So conversations are being had, but you really have to dig for them and be mindful because it's not going to be in a regular news cycle. You have to be looking for it and being engaged. I do think people have concerns, but what's the thing that we keep hearing a lot about, the AI hype? There is a hype, there's some fear going on. How do we combat that? We have people sit down and talk and really educate themselves appropriately and try to be forward thinking to understand what are the possibilities and how do we continue to leverage for the good. Conversations are being had, but I think that more time and effort needs to be put in it, which easy to say, hard to do, right? But making that prioritization when you're trying to bring the private and public sector together, um, making that a priority sometimes can be a conflict with shareholder wealth. I would say is what we see, but it's important work that needs to be done.
There are two bills that were recently introduced in California, AB 3211 and SB 1047. And interestingly, OpenAI, even Elon Musk kind of folks, they supported them. Talk a bit about the idea behind these bills and what kind of message these bills are sending to the larger industry.
I think that it's because of the speed of things happening and because we've had a lot of fear coming out of it, I think it's showing to say, hey, we're doing this in a responsible way. We want to make sure it has the potential, it already is really powerful technology, and saying, hey, there needs to be some guardrails and restrictions on there, so that it's done responsibly. And I think that's a great sign, right? That in that work being done. So I think that that's a message of saying, hey, let's maybe learn some of the lessons that we didn't manage with social media, which we won't even get into all that conversation, but I think there's lessons learned, which for me that's encouraging. That's a growth mindset of saying we can and should do better. We see this as a powerful emerging technology. Let's be forward thinking on all of it to make sure that we're doing for the public good.
Some of these companies, they feel that there should be no regulation, but these regulations, they do make us, the world safe around us. So what are your thoughts on regulating AI and social media? Now, regulating doesn't mean over regulating. There should be room for innovation, but the data, the so-called public data, should be protected. At the same time, it should not be abused as well. You cannot just take my data where I said Anne is an awesome person, and someone creates a video based on my data that says Anne is an awful person. So we should also, there should be some regulation from both sides, how you can consume the data or what you can do with the data. What are your thoughts on that?
I believe it all goes down to, and the word that you're saying is trust. By having those regulations in place, by having those standards, people trust. You just said you get on an airplane and you may not, it's an unconscious, right? Unconsciously, you may say, oh, this is safe. This is a safe mode of transportation. In the data space, that's really, really critical to trust as the security of it, to trust that you own it, to trust that the information that you're getting back is accurate and truthful. So without those regulations, without having those guidelines, standards, laws, whatnot, it leads to chaos and a lack of trust. And I think that's what it all boils down to, is that then people can trust, and with that trust, then you will have the growth. If you're a commercial company and you're in it for profit, that helps you to increase, because breaking trust with either, we see it commercially, you see it personally, once you break trust, it's really hard to regain it. And so putting those parameters in place really builds to trust. So that's where I think that's what it all boils down to, quite frankly.
Are you seeing any reassuring or positive development in this space where you're like, yeah, it's a new market, uh, industry is trying to figure things out, but we are moving in the right direction? Or you're like, no, things are not going where we wanted them to go, so we have to make more efforts to get it right?
What do we know? What do we know in the technology space? People are always going to push the boundaries, right? Right, for various reasons, right? You're always going to have those that are not, who are looking to do harm, right? The bad guys, if you will, that, right? The nefarious, but people, I believe, genuinely want to do the right thing, and they're going to get excited and they're going to push, right? So we have things in place, we have standards and regulations. We need to continue to maintain them, and have them evolve. But beware, people are going to push those boundaries, right? And to think otherwise is pretty naive.
No, thank you once again. And you may or may not be playing any role in this space, but where do you see Percona in this whole AI, Gen AI, and open source debate?
Well, in terms of with us being in the database space, as you're aware, we want to make sure that our customers have access to their data and it continues to be secure and scalable. So in that sense, we're going to be there to help our customers grow as they need to if they're developing on AI. For us as a company, we definitely are looking at how do we use it? How do we be consumers of it and use it in a way that ultimately brings more value to our customers? So some of that's just internal folks, and then we'll just continue to be on our history of being supporters of open source, right, and advocating for that um, in every way possible. That's not going to change.
When we talk about data and you're talking public data, there are two kind of data that we can clearly talk about. One is the commercially created, or we create data and we put it out ourselves. Uh, of course, news articles, news items, videos. Even I was, I'm have YouTubers, so MKBHD and all. They were complaining that some of these companies, I don't want to name those companies, they are using their YouTube videos to train their own models, and they are not very happy with that. Now, the same folks, the same influencer at one point, they were like celebrating it. And then the second kind of data is the data that we put on social media sites, where we are not publishing it. Sometimes we put restrictions that only our friends can see, but those companies have access to all the data. The Google's incognito mode is also, we all know that how much we can trust what sometimes is said. So we are looking at two sets of data. One is that is published under a specific license, how it can or cannot be used, and second is the data that we are putting on these social media sites where we literally have no control over how it will be used. So which of these two are you're seeing as a bigger concern when it comes to abuse of data in the AI space?
I think that the concern is the intention of the data, what it was being used for to begin with. So really understanding maybe the contracts that you have in place. So I think about, you mentioned like for Percona, as we think about our expertise that we have and the knowledge that we've had from working with customers, and how exciting to think like, ooh, some machine learning. How do we get insights from these problems that we've been continuing to solve over the years for our customers, and so that we can do it in a more efficient way and continue to bring value. But we stop and we definitely bring in our legal team and say, what can we do with this data? What can we do legally with this data? I'm not sure that everybody's thinking about that. The other point is, when we all get those terms and conditions that pop up quickly for us to go onto a website or an app, and we just click, what rights did we actually just give away that we're not even aware of? That now there's these unintended consequences that are looking at it. So what is public data, and what rights did you just give up, explicitly or implicitly? That concerns me, right? In terms of understanding that. And there definitely are regulations that, like I said, we're under contract with our customers as to what we can and cannot do. There are like the GDPR laws and privacy laws here in the United States as well. What do those mean, right? And what do they mean in this context? And are they being followed? And developers may not even be aware as they're playing with code and they're creating, as I think of the developers as creatives. They're being creative, but there's a big responsibility of what you're doing with that data. So I have concerns about data that has been given under a normal course of business that now might be used for other reasons that it was never intended for. And people could be very inadvertently misusing that data. So we have to be very intentional.
What if Percona was an AI company? How would you have dealt not only with the data, with the transparency? I mean, what would be an ideal AI company today?
Well, I believe based on creating an open source project that has clear intention from the beginning on what the licensing is, so that we can continue to build community and have the conversations, and providing that value out there. So that would be my goal, is with that project, but also because Percona is for profit, being mindful of what our business model is, growing and creating a beloved project is part of it, but then also what is that additional value that we would be providing that would be for customers in it over and above what maybe the users are getting. So that's, to me, that's the overall beauty of it. Open source projects bring value, and then be really clear as to what your business model is that you'd be giving on top.
And once again, thank you so much for sharing these great insights. As usual, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, not only from the perspective of, as I said, you should not become a fan, as somebody says, but I'm really fan of the way you approach, and I really wish there were more leaders like you in this open source world or in general tech world. So thank you so much, first of all, for leading a company like Percona, filling those shoes properly, but also leading a way for other companies to follow as well, how they can become very good open source citizens, no matter how much the time has changed. So thanks for those great insights, and I would love to sit down and chat with you again. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you.